Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. In each episode of this podcast, we will chat with energy experts from all around the world. They will tell us about their passion, inspiration, and aspiration. With them, we will delve into some timely energy issues. We will get to know both their professional and personal trajectories. We will hear their advice for all of us. What is the goal? Make you discover different personalities and inspire you to carry out your own project that will impact our energy future, the energy of tomorrow. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today I'm interviewing Cristina Haus. She's a very seasoned energy economist and analyst. She's been working for 25 years at Energy Intelligence as the editor of Jet Fuel Intelligence. And she's a worldwide expert on aviation with an emphasis on jet fuel. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Leslie.
So, Christina, I have to say that you played a big role in my own trajectory in the energy space because I'm still in the US, but also and above all, I found my path in the energy sector because you helped me get my first job at Energy Intelligence. We're both alumni of the Fletcher School, and I had reached out to you to as part of my networking when I was looking for a job, and I've been very fortunate to find you on my way. So thank you.
Well, it was a pleasure, and I'm really delighted to see how far you've gone in such a short period of time.
Yeah, thank you. So today we're going to discuss what's going on in the aviation sector when it comes to energy, and you're the person to ask about all those recent developments that might be disruptive for the industry. So I know you've been looking at different regulations and upcoming developments. Tell us a little bit more about what's going on in the industry those days.
Okay, well, I would say the biggest challenge now for aviation, like any sector really that pollutes, is the environmental challenge. And there's a lot of talk about regulation, but in many ways, aviation is way ahead of governments in devising a strategy on how to deal with emissions because they currently aviation accounts for a relatively small 3% of CO2. But it's
I thought
going
it was going to be much more actually.
right, but it's only 3% at this point. But the problem is that it's growing very fast. IATA, the International Air Transport Association, came out with their new 20-year forecast that projects a doubling of air traffic in the next 20 years through 2037. And most of that growth is coming from Asia. So countries like India and China with populations of over 1 billion people, where only 1% of the population now travels by air. You're going to see huge growth. So IATA says passenger traffic will grow from 44 billion people last year to 8 billion by 2037, with more than half that growth coming from Asia. So, how do you have a sustainable industry given that you're flying airplanes that pollute all the time? I mean, 24 hours a day. And so 10 years ago, the aviation industry recognized this and through IATA came up with a strategy on controlling emissions. And it has several goals. The first one comes in 2020, and that's carbon neutral growth. The second one comes in 2050, and that's the target of cutting the sector's emissions by 50%. That's 50 from the levels in 2005. Now, how are they going to do this? One of the main ways is fleet renewal. The new aircraft are much more fuel efficient than the old generation aircraft. The Boeing 787, for instance, is 25% more fuel efficient than the plane that it replaces. So there's a lot of fleet renewal going on. The problem is that costs money, and some airlines just don't have the funds to put into fleet renewal. The other problem is it takes about 30 years to turn over the global fleet. So this is a gradual effect, the fleet modernization. The other way is operational. So airlines are doing a lot to make their flights more efficient. You've probably seen the smaller seat size. That's because they're putting more seats in every plane so that they can fly more people in any given flight.
Yeah.
They've
Is it
lightened.
also like I feel our tickets are more expensive? Do they already include the cost of fleet renewal?
No, a lot of that is fees that they add on for all kinds of services. But I mean, the airline industry, certainly in the US, they will argue that, in fact, fares are lower than they were, say, 10 years ago, adjusted for inflation. So that they would take issue with that. But well, the airline industry right now is very profitable. It's more profitable than it's ever been in its history. And that is mainly because of very strong air traffic growth. And until this year, relatively low fuel prices. Fuel has shot up and is now 30 to 40% higher than it was a year ago. So that's a real operating challenge. So that's another reason to become as efficient as possible in engine and airframe. And so operationally, they've reduced the weight. The engines have become far more efficient. And they're trying to fly straighter flight paths, which depends, of course, on air traffic. And they're putting the onus on governments and regulatory agencies to improve air traffic control. And in the United States, that centers mainly around the next gen. It's a satellite-based air traffic control system that is supposed to replace the current radar-based system, and it will make airline flight trajectories much straighter from place to place instead of,
very interesting.
and that will make a big difference. So there's a lot of work going on around just the air traffic part, but that again, it depends on money. In the US, there was a really important bill passed last month. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, Congress approved their reauthorization. So it's funding for 5 years. And airlines are hoping that that will help introduce more of the next gen system across the United States. In Europe, the counterpart is the single European sky. And that also, it faces funding problems, and also the issue of Brexit, what happens with once the UK exits the European Union. And that's another big challenge for airlines. IATA came out with a statement this week saying that the UK and the EU need to have contingency plans in place so that air traffic just doesn't stop next March. Because
So
right
from
now,
what
there's nothing in place to keep not only people but goods crossing the border between the UK and the rest of the world and the EU.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So from what you're saying, it seems that it's a combination of governmental regulations and technology that is driving changes in the aviation to cut CO2 emissions.
Yes, and it's also, people talk so much about government regulation, but I think industry itself, and certainly the aviation sector is a prime example, have done a lot on their own because they know that in order to keep growing, they have to grow sustainably. And in order to do that, they have to have a strategy. And the other key aspect of how they're licensed to grow is sustainable aviation fuels. Previously, these were known as biofuels, but they got away from that terminology because it was too linked to the ethanol business in the United States, which a lot of people consider to be a disaster in terms of the politics of it and then the economic.
Very bad press, yeah.
So now the term is sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, and there are already several pathways to make these fuels that have been approved. by the ASTM International, which is the supranational body that governs aviation fuel. I mean, that's the other interesting thing, that jet fuel, unlike every other refined product, except for marine fuel, is not regulated by national bodies, because shipping and aviation they're international businesses. They cross borders by definition. So it's ASTM International in conjunction with, say, the Federal Aviation Organization administration in the US, and then the Defense Standard body in the UK that regulates the jet fuel specification. And they've approved at this point about 5 different pathways for making these sustainable aviation fuels. The problem is there is no volume currently at a commercial scale. There's only one plant that's up and running, and that's in near Los Angeles. These sustainable aviation fuels can be made out of any number of feedstocks. In fact, you can make one of the most promising prospects is making jet fuel out of municipal solid waste. And there are two or more projects in the UK and in Europe that are planning on using that technology. But the one in California is the original process, and that's made out of waste fats. And it is already supplying United Airlines with a blend of fuel that includes sustainable aviation fuel as well as petroleum fuel on their flights from LA to San Francisco. The other thing about these fuels, these new fuels, is that they aren't 100%. The ASTM has a ceiling on the, I'll call it biofuel portion of it, up to 50%. But in practice, because there isn't a lot of volume available, airlines are using really not more than 30% mixed with regular aviation fuel. The other important point is that these are known as drop-in fuels, which means they can be mixed with regular jet fuel anywhere in the tank, in the pipeline, in the aircraft fuel tank, and storage tanks. And that really is the most important thing on these new fuels, because unlike ethanol, which had to be and still has to be transported separately, usually by a truck because it can't be put through pipeline systems. These new fuels are all known as drop-in fuels. They are completely chemically identical to a petroleum-based aviation
Very interesting.
fuel.
Yeah.
And that
And when do you think the share of those fuels will increase significantly and will start to have an impact on refined fuels, on the
so
demand for refined products? Yeah.
right. Well, next year is a big milestone, and that's when ASTM is supposed to approve.
What is ASTM? Sorry.
ASTM is the standards body, ASTM International. It's the supranational body that governs the jet fuel specification, whether it's the petroleum processed jet fuel or these new fuels that are coming into the market. And they have been evaluating for a number of years a process to make jet fuel that Neste, the Finnish company Neste, has been using for at least 10 years to make biodiesel. And Neste is now the largest in the world. They produce upwards of 2.6 million tons of biodiesel at plants in Rotterdam, Finland, and in Singapore. And they are expanding the Singapore plant starting next year. So this new specification for this new aviation fuel is based on Neste's biodiesel. You just make a small change in the refining process, and you can use that fuel for jet fuel. And that approval should happen sometime in the middle of next year, it is hoped.
Okay.
The airline manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, and the engine manufacturers are still evaluating some of the final results on the extensive testing that has gone on. And this will be a game changer, because all of a sudden you've got the volume, It's already there. It's already being produced. You have the fact that diesel in Europe, as you know, is falling dramatically, diesel demand, because of what happened with the Volkswagen cheating scandal and just other factors.
And pollution in big cities.
Exactly. So Nesta has a strategy of offsetting the decline in the road sector of demand for that fuel and feeding it into the aviation sector, because in terms of aircraft pollution, it's much lower. It's, I think they're saying, up to 80% less CO2 than a petroleum jet fuel. So this will be, in my view, huge, because all of a sudden you have this pent up airline demand because they want to use these new fuels in order to meet their sustainability goals. And you have a producer who's ready and willing to make it at prices that are compatible with current prices for petroleum jet fuel. And that's been the big stumbling block with a lot of these new processes for making fuels, is the fuels are so much more expensive than a regular jet fuel. So, who's going to buy it?
Yeah.
And
very interesting.
And so the future of these new fuels depends on them being cost effective. Another thing that will make them more cost effective are some of these carbon regulations that are coming into play. And this is where you get bodies like the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is the UN organization that regulates aviation. They came out with a policy on, it's called CORSIA, and I can't think right now what that stands for, but it's a market-based mechanism for regulating aircraft emissions. It's basically like what the European Union does now with its emissions trading system. And it's a way of offsetting carbon emissions. And that comes into play in 2026. And under that scheme, sustainable aviation fuels are not liable for carbon charges. So that's a huge incentive. And that's another way that these new fuels will have parity or even an advantage over petroleum fuel, because airlines won't be paying for their emissions.
Yeah. And is everybody complying with those new regulations, or are there risks of non-compliance? I'm following a lot the International Maritime Organization and the switch by 2020 because of more stringent sulfur emission regulation. And a big question mark is compliance in high sea.
Right. Well, aviation
something,
aviation is very different in that respect, because there already is a system that's been set up on reporting emissions. And in fact, airlines, as of January 2019, in just 3 months, will have to start reporting their emissions to the regulatory authorities. So there is no scope for cheating, essentially. And there is a lot of incentive to use these new fuels to get around paying the emissions charges. So that's, I think, where the airline business has a lot more scope to want a lot more incentive to use these new fuels, because there's no way to get around it, unlike the shipping business, where there's a lot of talk around non-compliance.
Yeah. So let me ask, I remember, Cristina, you were following very closely the adventure of Solar Pulse.
Right.
And can you give us an update on and what it is, because maybe not everybody has followed the story?
Right. Well, that was something that I learned about more than 10 years ago at a fuels conference, an IATA fuels conference. And one of the co-founders, Bertrand Piccard, gave a talk about how he was going to fly a plane around the world using not a single drop of fuel. And I found it completely fascinating. And at that point, the plane hadn't even been built. And in fact, many players in the aviation business told him it was impossible. So the company that ended up building the plane was actually a shipbuilding company.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
in composites, the same Swiss company that built the World Cup sailboat that won the World Cup a while ago.
Yeah.
So basically, it's thinking completely in completely new ways and throwing out all the parameters for how a plane should be built or how engines should be built. And in working with physicists and a huge array of mainly Swiss partners, Bertrand and André Borschberg, the other co-founder, succeeded in 2015 and 2016 in a lot of different stages, but they did succeed in flying this plane. And the point was not to show that an airplane could be, a commercial aircraft could be powered by the sun,
Right.
but more to show that you can use renewable energy technologies that exist today and achieve this goal. It was more a proof of concept. And so they've moved on now, and Bertrand Piccard is working with the European Commission to identify 1,000 renewable energy projects across the world that can be financed without government subsidies by 2020. And I think he's well on the way to achieving that. And André Borschberg has set up an electric plane company in Switzerland that's already producing a plane. It's a two-seater, and it's going to be used for flight training. And it has, I think, a range of 2 hours.
Fascinating.
It is, and so I was very interested in the whole idea of electric aircraft after following this amazing round the world journey. And so I spoke to NASA last year and asked them about what their projects were in this field, and in fact wrote a piece about electric aircraft. And there you can also see some really promising developments, and it's mainly around a hybrid electric plane, which NASA and Boeing think could be in service, a kind of smaller regional jet that is like a Prius in the sense that would use the battery for takeoff, because the most of the propulsion is needed for takeoff.
Yeah.
And if they can figure out how to do this, you can essentially put batteries on a plane that are used in takeoff and use much, much smaller engines. So you can take the whole global fleet, retrofit it with smaller engines and with batteries, and you can cut emissions by 50%. That's another
It's huge. Yeah.
really huge development, and really exciting, because I think certainly for the smaller regional planes, which you're seeing more and more because the large airports are so congested and some of the smaller airports aren't being adequately served. So this would be a really perfect way to expand air travel to smaller outlying locations, and also to cut emissions from the larger jets if they can figure out the battery part. There still needs to be more work on that.
Well, that seems to be the future. Very fascinating.
Right. No, really, there's a lot going on that doesn't really get reported in the general press because it's not going to happen today or tomorrow. But once it does happen, it will change the way we fly airplanes.
I wanted to ask you about your personal trajectory
Uh-huh.
and how you got into the energy sector, and any tips that you can give to people that are listening to us and are interested in the sector. And I know you have a niche expertise, and I was wondering if you always knew that you would get into jet fuel and aviation, or how did you get to this sector?
Well, kind of by accident. I had studied energy economics at the Fletcher School after the Iranian Revolution, so it was really the topic of the moment. And in fact, it really always is an important topic. I think you can see in your work also that energy is what makes the world go round. And certainly the geopolitics, they come and they ebb and they flow, but it's always a big factor in the price of energy and how energy is used. So I was always fascinated by that aspect. And I originally started out at Petroleum Intelligence Weekly, which was at the time really the only publication that covered petroleum at a very analytical level. And so after 4 years, I left to have my first child, and I was doing freelance work. And the new head of energy intelligence called me and said they were just launching an aviation publication and looking for an editor. And I actually turned him down. I said I didn't want to work full time because at that point I had two children and I wanted to work from home and I didn't know anything about aviation fuel.
Yeah.
So he said, "Well, you'll learn fast because you understand petroleum." And
By
then,
the way, a little parenthesis, it was exactly the same for me. I had no idea what was LNG when I got, my first interview.
right, right, but you learn fast. I mean, it's a
We
very
learned fast.
yeah, it's a steep learning curve, but um, my real expertise came after about 2 or 3 years when I was invited to my first meeting of the International Air Transport Association Fuel Forum, and that was a real change for me because I met in one room basically all of the fuel buyers, meaning the airline fuel buyers, and all of the sellers, mainly oil company sellers, and then the into-plane companies, the companies that actually do the physical refueling. And this was a meeting it's off limits to journalists, but I was invited as a special guest to give a presentation and have been going ever since. So for more than 20 years, and you develop incredible amount of knowledge that is not in books, it's not in the newspapers, it's not even on the internet. It's new things that people tell you about what is happening in the business, and that's where my expertise came. And that's what made me able to have a job that I could basically dictate the terms of how I wanted to do it, which is working from home so I could be with the children and working part time so I could manage a life.
Well, it seems you managed to combine both work and personal life and get some flexibility to enable to do both.
Right. I mean, it's hard, as you know, but it, I think, is extremely rewarding because I stayed in the workforce doing what I liked and what I found really interesting, whereas many women of my generation gave up their jobs for whatever reason. So, and the children are grown now, but I'm still doing really, really interesting writing and traveling, and occasionally I'm asked to give presentations at conferences. So it's been a very rewarding career, I have to say, and I feel really privileged that I could do it on my own terms.
Yeah. I mean, not many workplace accept, working from home every day of the week. They may accept one day or,
Right, right.
occasionally. But I think as a mother, and I mean, it happened to me, like when I was working remotely in my previous company, I was traveling a lot and I was commuting a lot between New York and Washington, D.C. But most of the time, otherwise, I was working, from my home desk.
Mhm.
And I think, there is stereotype thinking that when you're working from home, you're working less. But I think I was working more actually, but on
Oh,
my own hours.
absolutely. It's that, and then you're not wasting time commuting.
Right.
So I find I'm hugely productive. And well, as you know, it also requires a lot of discipline, but I'm that as well. And then the other benefit I think is that I have two daughters, and that they have extremely good work ethics, and I think it came from having a mother who set an example.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a really good role model for them.
Yeah. No, bravo, Christina.
Well,
And
thank
yeah,
you.
no, and otherwise on the conferences, I think it has been the same for me. I learned so much in going to, you know, the sector conferences, LNG conferences, gas conferences, and meeting and networking with people, but also hearing and observing
Right.
what's going on in yeah. But you need to travel for that, and traveling is for me it never bothered me, but it's true that you need to not overdo it neither when you have a family.
No, no, I was lucky because these IATA meetings are just twice a year.
Yeah,
And they're in very interesting places in different continents, different countries. So I've been all over the world,
yeah,
which has been also a real privilege.
yeah. Great experience, definitely.
Great,
Great.
yes, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Christina. I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners learned also. And I think you have a very inspiring trajectory, and that will inspire many other people.
Well,
So
thank
thank
you
you.
very much, Leslie. I really enjoyed being your first interviewee,
Exactly.
and it's been a real privilege, setting a path that you could follow in certain ways.
Yeah, and I think you really have been a role model. So thank you.
No, you're so welcome.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Okay. Yeah, bye-bye.
That concludes our Energy Vista podcast. Our theme music is provided by Music Screen, licensed under Creative Commons. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.